What is that? If you grew up back then, you'd know it.
Good night and good morning.
A Native American figure in a headdress, centered inside a target pattern that filled the whole screen. But whose face was it, and why an Indian? It was there most nights until sometime in the early 70s, when it quietly disappeared, replaced by something even stranger. So why did it change? What's the reason for any of it in the first place? And then the question underneath all of that, the one that gets more interesting the longer you sit with it. How did we get from a screen that knew when to stop to one that never does? Maybe the sign-off said more about us than it ever did about the screen. For most of American broadcasting history, the day had a hard edge. This is where it came from and why it's gone. The sign-off had a shape. It was the same shape in Topeka and Tampa and Tulsa. The anthem came first. The Star-Spangled Banner played over footage of the American flag. Sometimes the flag was on a pole in front of a courthouse. Sometimes it was a slow pan across the Iwo Jima Memorial. The footage didn't matter. The anthem was the signal. The broadcast day was ending, and the station was saying goodbye. After the anthem, on many stations, came a poem. High Flight, written in 1941 by a 19-year-old Royal Canadian Air Force pilot named John Gillespie McGee, Jr., who died that same year when his Spitfire collided with another plane over Lincolnshire, England. He'd written it on the back of a letter to his parents. "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth," it begins, "and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings." American television stations adopted it for the sign-off because it sounded like the right way to end a day. A man climbing away from the earth toward something that held still. A lot of nights ended with that poem. After High Flight came the test pattern. The one most Americans alive in the 50s and 60s would recognize was the RCA Indian head, a Native American figure in a headdress centered in a bullseye of concentric circles and geometric bands. RCA designed it in 1939. It ran on American screens for more than 30 years. The headdress wasn't decorative. It was functional. The elaborate rows of feathers, thin, repeating, densely packed, were exactly the kind of detail that exposed a badly calibrated picture tube. If the scanning wasn't right, the feathers blurred. If the resolution was off, they disappeared into noise. The headdress was a resolution test disguised as iconography. Engineers could look at those feathers and know immediately whether the set was holding together. And the face itself was designed to do something specific, show the full range of human skin tone in a single image, so technicians could calibrate brightness and contrast against something recognizable. RCA needed it ambiguous, not legibly male or female, not identifiably one person. The result was a face that could have been anyone, a composite, an approximation, a face assembled from engineering requirements. Nobody knows whose face it is. Anonymous, by specification. For 30 years, it stared out of American screens at the end of every broadcast day, unnamed and uncredited, into every living room in the country. Then color arrived, and the Indian head couldn't follow. Black and white calibration was about luminance, the range between light and dark. Color calibration was a different problem entirely. You needed to verify that your reds were actually red, your greens actually green, that the signal wasn't drifting toward magenta or cyan or something the engineers hadn't intended. A face couldn't tell you that. You needed something more explicit. The SMPTE color bars, developed by the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers in the early 1970s, became the standard. 7 vertical bars, white, yellow, cyan, green, magenta, red, blue. Each one at a specific measurable color value, not iconic, not ambiguous. Completely legible to a technician with a waveform monitor. The face was replaced by something that looked less like a person and more like the signal itself, stripped down and laid bare. Neither of them looked like television, that was the point. And with the pattern came a tone, steady, approximately 1,000 hertz, unchanging. Engineers chose that frequency carefully. It sits just above the threshold of annoyance. Not quite intrusive, not quite ignorable. You'd come back to yourself sometime after midnight. The room the same, the chair the same, but the television was no longer television. The face on the screen was no one's face. The tone was not program audio. And it had been that way for hours, and it would keep being that way until the engineers came in at dawn. That was the end. That was what you found if you stayed long enough. The sign-off existed because broadcasting was not continuous, not because anyone was being thoughtful about your sleep. A television station held an FCC license to transmit on a specific frequency within specific geographic limits. And in the early decades of television, there was no economic argument for using that license past midnight. Consider what it cost to run a station in 1960. A building, a transmitter, engineers, directors, camera operators, announcers, programming, either produced in-house or bought from a network by the hour. All of it funded by advertising. At 2 a.m., the advertising wasn't there. Nobody was buying 30-second spots in the middle of the night 60 years ago. The audience that existed was asleep in the chair, not calling the number on the screen. So the math was simple. Revenue stopped. The transmitter rested. The building went dark. There was also maintenance. A transmitter running at full power heats up. Engineers needed overnight windows to inspect equipment, replace tubes, calibrate levels. The sign-off was, in part, just the station turning off the lights and going home. What the audience received, the anthem, the poem, the test pattern, the tone, was a ritual built on top of a mundane necessity. The station had to stop, so it learned how to say good night. Here is the part that doesn't get discussed. Every night, without announcement, without coordination, tens of millions of American households arrived at the same sound at roughly the same moment. Not approximately the same time. The same sound, the same anonymous face, the same 1,000 hertz tone. The moon landing was synchronized. The Super Bowl was synchronized. But those were occasions, events the country gathered for by decision. The sign-off was not an occasion. It was just Tuesday. Just any Wednesday in February with nothing on after the late news. Every night, the ending stacked across time zones, unannounced, uncovered by anyone. What you were part of when you fell asleep in front of that test pattern in 1974 was one of the only truly synchronized experiences in pre-internet American life that nobody had chosen to have. The Super Bowl you watched on purpose. The sign-off you stumbled into. And the thing you stumbled into alongside everybody. A stranger 2 blocks over heard the same tone. A stranger in a city you'd never visited. On an ordinary night, in a country that was otherwise largely invisible to itself. You didn't know their name. You never would. But for that moment, before you got up and went to bed, you were in the same room. The television had a bedtime. Not yours, its own. If you fell asleep in front of it, you didn't end the day. The day ended on its own and left you there. Sometime after that, you'd surface, to the anthem, to the snow, to the tone that was designed to find the person who had stopped paying attention. It worked. You knew where you were. You knew you'd held on past the end. The house was quiet. You could go to bed. The sign-off didn't die all at once. In the early 1970s, if you were awake at 3 a.m. in most American cities and you turned on the television, you found nothing. The test pattern. Sometimes a card that read, "Please stand by." Sometimes just the tone in the bars, holding. The overnight was not a slot. It was a gap. Broadcasting had closed, and the gap ran until the engineers came in at dawn. The first push toward filling it came from cable. In 1976, Ted Turner's WTBS in Atlanta became one of the first American stations to broadcast 24 hours a day. Old movies, syndicated reruns, programming bought cheap and run again. But the hours were filled. The screen didn't go dark. As cable spread through the early 1980s, HBO, CNN, ESPN arriving on long coaxial runs from rooftop dishes, the overnight stopped being a gap and became a slot. And slots attract things that need slots. The infomercial, the paid program, the too bright studio, the face that wanted something from you and a number to call. Where there had been a face that was no one's face and a tone designed to wake you, there was now a face that needed you awake. The floor under the night filled in, and the sign-off, having nowhere to happen, stopped happening. One more thing. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch. That evening, President Reagan addressed the nation. He had been scheduled to deliver the State of the Union. He postponed it. He closed his remarks with the last lines of High Flight. "We will never forget them," he said, "nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." The poem that had signed off the American broadcast day for 40 years, written on the back of a letter to a dead pilot's parents, the poem that meant the screen was done and the house was quiet, became, in one broadcast, the poem a president used to close a national tragedy. The sign-off language became grief language. That is not a coincidence. It is a demonstration of how deeply the ritual had embedded itself. The poem felt right for that moment, not because Reagan chose a poem about flying. It felt right because tens of millions of Americans had heard it at the end of things, over and over for decades in the dark, just before they let go. The language of the sign-off was already the language of farewell. Reagan didn't repurpose it. He found it where it lived. Nobody announced the last sign-off. There was no ceremony. One night, a station played the anthem for the last time, and the next night they didn't. And if you were there for both, you probably didn't notice. Because why would you? You were watching the screen, not the ritual wrapped around its edge. The sign-off was one of those things that vanished by being replaced, not by being retired. And what replaced it wasn't just programming. It was a different idea about what a screen is for. The Indian head test pattern was a tool for engineers, but it was also accidentally a boundary. The broadcast day ended because human beings who ran transmitters and directed cameras and sold advertising and wrote poetry in the back of letters had to sleep, had to stop. The screen reflected that. It was a human institution broadcasting human limits. What runs now doesn't have limits, or rather, its limits are yours alone, and it already knows you'll push them. YouTube cues the next video before the last one ends. The algorithm has already decided what you're watching next. The screen doesn't wait for you to choose. It assumes you'll stay. Nobody was watching the Indian head either, but it stopped. That's the thing. The sign-off wasn't really about content. It wasn't about what was or wasn't worth putting on the air at midnight. It was about us, about a society that still believed the day should end, that there was a wall between the broadcast world and the quiet dark of a house at 2 a.m., and that the wall was supposed to hold. That wall is gone. What went with it is the assumption underneath it that the screen was a guest in your home, and guests eventually leave, that the night was yours when the programming stopped, that the day was something with an edge, and the edge meant something. 3 short things: the anthem, the poem, the test pattern, and then the day let go. That's all it was. That's all it needed to be. If you remember the sign-off, the anthem, the test pattern, the snow, drop it in the comments. Which station? Which city? I'd genuinely like to know. And if this is the kind of thing you come here for, subscribe. There's more where this one came from. Back then with Frank.